Chapter 1. I should have known better than to take on another group of city folk with more money than sense. The 5 of them struggled up the final switchback like they were climbing Everest instead of heading to a basic campsite at 8,000 feet. Their gear cost more than my truck, all of it fresh from REI with tags barely removed. Jacob Williams led the pack, or tried to, his brand new hiking boots already giving him blisters I could see him trying to hide. Behind him, Emily Carter clutched her bear spray like a talisman, checking over her shoulder every few steps. David Brooks had managed to keep his satellite phone in his hand for the entire 3-mile hike, periodically holding it up to check for signal that wouldn't come this deep in the mountains. Madison Lee filmed everything, her camera somehow staying steady even when she stumbled over roots. At least she seemed to have decent balance. Ryan Mitchell brought up the rear, breathing hard and looking like he regretted every life choice that had led him to this moment. "How much further?" Jacob called back to me, though we'd only been hiking for 2 hours. "We're here." I gestured to the clearing ahead where Willow Creek cut through the valley in a series of white rapids. Pine and aspen crowded the edges, their branches creating natural windbreaks on 3 sides. The group dropped their packs with obvious relief, Jacob immediately sitting on a fallen log to examine his feet. I'd seen this routine dozens of times before. Rich people who thought a weekend in Vail qualified them for backcountry camping, buying every piece of equipment the sales kid recommended without understanding how to use half of it. "This is perfect," Emily said, though her voice carried that nervous edge I'd noticed during our initial meeting in Denver. She kept the bear spray clipped to her belt even now, scanning the tree line like grizzlies might charge out at any moment. Madison walked the perimeter of the clearing, filming everything from multiple angles. "My followers are going to love this," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. I pointed to a level spot about 30 feet from the creek. "Tents go there, uphill from the water source. Fire pit here." I indicated a ring of stones some previous camper had assembled. "Gear gets stored in the bear boxes or hung from that branch." I nodded toward a sturdy pine with a horizontal limb about 12 feet up. David finally lowered his phone long enough to look around. "No signal at all." "None for the next 40 miles. That's why you hired me instead of using GPS." Jacob stood up, testing his weight on both feet. "Seems pretty tame so far. I was expecting something more challenging." I bit back my first response. They always said that on day 1. "Let's get camp set up before we lose daylight." The next hour involved more comedy than I cared to watch. Jacob tried to pitch his 4-season mountaineering tent like it was a pop-up canopy, getting the rainfly twisted 3 different ways before asking for help. Emily managed hers with methodical precision, reading every instruction twice before making each move. David kept getting distracted by his phone, which meant Ryan ended up helping him with his setup. Madison documented all of it, narrating her footage with commentary about authentic wilderness experiences. I got the fire started while they struggled with their sleeping arrangements. The afternoon sun angled low through the trees, casting long shadows across our clearing. In a few hours, those shadows would merge into complete darkness, and this group needed to understand what that meant out here. By the time everyone had their gear sorted, I had a good fire crackling in the stone ring. I'd positioned myself where I could see all their faces in the firelight, important for what came next. "Gather around," I said, settling onto my camp stool. "Time for the safety briefing." Jacob groaned. "We already covered this stuff back in Denver." That was the general overview. This is how you stay alive in these mountains. Emily immediately moved closer to the fire, bear spray still within easy reach. The others arranged themselves in a rough circle, Madison continuing to film while David checked his phone one more time before giving up. 5 rules, I began, meeting each of their eyes in turn. Non-negotiable. Break them, and you're on your own. Ryan shifted uncomfortably on his log seat. What kind of rules? Rule 1. After sunset, nobody leaves this campsite. Not to use the bathroom, not to get water, not for any reason. You stay within the fire's light until dawn. Jacob snorted. Come on, that's a bit paranoid, don't you think? I ignored him. Rule 2. If you hear bells ringing at night, stay by the fire and don't move until sunrise. Don't investigate the sound. Don't call out. Don't do anything except wait. Bells? Emily's voice pitched higher. What kind of bells? The kind that don't belong out here. I fed another branch into the flames. Rule 3. If you encounter anyone in these woods who isn't part of our group, you retreat to camp immediately. Don't talk to them. Don't help them. Don't engage with them at all. David lowered his phone completely now. Are we expecting other hikers? No. I let that hang in the air for a moment. Rule 4. Never accept anything from strangers. Food, water, flowers, directions, doesn't matter what it is. You politely decline and come back here. Madison stopped filming. This is starting to sound like something out of a horror movie. Rule 5, I continued without addressing her comment. If someone stands outside your tent at night, you ignore them completely. Don't answer if they call your name. Don't unzip your tent to look. Don't acknowledge their presence in any way. They'll move on if you wait long enough. The fire popped, sending sparks up into the darkening sky. Jacob shook his head with exaggerated disbelief. Let me get this straight, he said. We're supposed to believe there are random strangers wandering around the wilderness at night, ringing bells and offering people flowers? You're supposed to follow the rules I just gave you. Whether you believe them or not is your choice. This is ridiculous. Jacob stood up and gestured at the peaceful clearing around us. Look at this place. It's beautiful, sure, but it's not some haunted forest from a fairy tale. We're grown adults, not children who need to be scared into good behavior. Emily frowned at him. Thomas has been guiding people through these mountains for decades. Maybe we should listen to his experience instead of assuming we know better. Experience with what? Ghost stories to keep tourists from wandering off and getting lost? I'd heard variations of this argument from dozens of clients over the years. The smart ones listened anyway. The others usually learned why the rules existed, though not all of them made it home to share their newfound wisdom. These aren't ghost stories, I said calmly. They're survival instructions based on 30 years of guiding in this region. You can follow them or ignore them, but I won't be responsible for the consequences if you choose wrong. David cleared his throat. Has anyone actually broken these rules before? I poked at the fire with a stick, stirring up more sparks. Some have. And what happened to them? They didn't come back. That silenced even Jacob for a few moments. The creek continued its constant murmur, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called through the trees. Normal forest sounds that would become anything but normal once full darkness fell. Ryan spoke up quietly. How long have you been seeing these, whatever they are? Long enough to know the rules work if you follow them. I looked around the circle again. Anyone who can't commit to following all 5 rules should pack up now and hike out while we still have daylight. Nobody moved. Emily nodded firmly. David put his phone away completely, and even Madison stopped fiddling with her camera. Ryan looked nervous but determined. Jacob remained standing, arms crossed over his expensive fleece jacket. This is the most elaborate scare tactic I've ever encountered. You really expect us to believe there are supernatural threats lurking in a national forest? I expect you to stay alive long enough to pay my fee. That got a few nervous laughs from the others, though Jacob's expression didn't change. He sat back down with obvious reluctance. Fine, we'll play along with your mountain man folklore, but don't expect me to take this seriously. I started pulling food from my pack, signaling the end of the safety briefing. Dinner in 20 minutes. After we eat, everyone stays by the fire until bedtime. No exceptions. The meal passed with lighter conversation about the scenery and tomorrow's planned hike to a scenic overlook. Madison resumed filming, capturing the group's interactions around the campfire. David managed to participate without checking his phone more than once every few minutes. Emily relaxed slightly as the evening wore on, though she still jumped at every unexpected sound from the forest. Jacob kept up a steady stream of commentary about the ridiculous superstitions they'd been subjected to, making jokes about mountain spirits and fairy tale warnings. The others laughed along politely, but I noticed how their eyes kept drifting to the tree line as full darkness settled over our camp. The fire created a bubble of warm light in the vast wilderness, and beyond its reach, the forest became an impenetrable wall of black. Somewhere out there, things older than recorded history waited with infinite patience for someone foolish enough to ignore the rules that kept them at bay. Jacob continued his mockery of what he called my bedtime story session, but his voice sounded smaller now against the enormous silence of the mountains. The others finished their meals quietly, glancing more frequently toward the dark spaces between the trees. Chapter 2. The pre-dawn darkness felt different when I opened my eyes at 5:30. Lighter somehow, less oppressive than the weight that had settled over our camp the night before. I lay in my sleeping bag for a few moments, listening to the familiar sounds of wind moving through pine boughs and the constant murmur of Willow Creek 30 feet away. No bells, no footsteps circling the tents, no whispered voices calling names from the tree line. I unzipped my tent flap quietly and stepped into the cold morning air. 5 dome tents arranged in their neat semicircle, all zipped tight, all occupied. I could hear Ryan's soft snoring from the blue tent closest to the creek, and Madison's tent showed the faint glow of her phone screen as she probably edited footage from yesterday. The fire had burned down to gray ash and a few glowing embers. I stirred the coals with a stick and added some kindling, grateful for this normal morning routine. Sometimes the first night went smoothly. Usually it meant the second night would test them harder, but I'd take peaceful when I could get it. Jacob emerged from his tent 20 minutes later, stretching and looking around the camp with obvious satisfaction. His expensive gear hadn't failed him, and he'd slept comfortably in his $1,000 sleeping bag. The blisters on his feet had apparently healed enough that he walked without the careful gait from yesterday. "Well," he announced loudly enough to wake anyone still sleeping, "looks like we all survived the night without supernatural intervention." Emily's tent zipper opened and she stuck her head out, hair messy but alert. "Good morning, Thomas. Everything okay?" "Everything's fine. Coffee in 10 minutes." Jacob laughed and began his morning routine of checking his expensive gear. "I have to say, that was some performance last night. Really committed to the role of mysterious mountain guide with his ancient warnings." I poured water into my camp pot and set it on the portable stove. The blue flame caught immediately, and soon steam began rising into the crisp air. Emily emerged fully dressed and walked over to where I was preparing breakfast. "Thank you for keeping us safe," she said quietly, bear spray already clipped to her belt for the day. "Rules work if you follow them." Jacob overheard this exchange and shook his head with amusement. "Come on, Emily. Nothing happened because there was nothing to happen. This is a national forest, not some cursed land from a horror movie." Emily turned toward him, her jaw set with irritation. "Thomas has 30 years of experience in these mountains. Maybe we should trust his judgment instead of assuming what? That I'm capable of rational thought?" Jacob interrupted, not bothering to keep his voice down. "I paid good money for a wilderness experience, not a bedtime story session designed to keep grown adults huddled around a campfire like scared children." I continued preparing breakfast while they talked, measuring coffee grounds into the metal pot. The water was almost ready, and I had no interest in mediating their disagreement. Jacob would learn or he wouldn't. My job was to give him the opportunity to make that choice. David crawled out of his tent, holding his satellite phone, immediately lifting it toward the sky to check for signal. Madison followed with her camera already recording, capturing the morning camp routine and Jacob's increasingly animated lecture about wilderness psychology. "The whole thing is obviously a liability protection strategy," Jacob continued, now addressing the entire group. "Create scary folklore to keep clients from wandering off and getting lost. Then if something does happen, the guide can claim he warned them about supernatural threats. It's actually pretty clever from a legal standpoint. I poured boiling water over the coffee grounds and let it steep. Steam rose from the pot, carrying the rich aroma that meant morning in the mountains. Ryan had finally emerged from his tent and was quietly rolling up his sleeping bag, staying out of the conversation. "Breakfast ready in 5 minutes," I announced. "We'll head out for the overlook after everyone eats." The meal consisted of oatmeal with dried fruit and the camp coffee that somehow always tasted better in wilderness settings. Jacob continued his commentary throughout, explaining to anyone who would listen how guide services used psychological manipulation to enhance their mystique. Emily ate in silence, occasionally glancing at the tree line with the alertness I'd seen in her since yesterday. Madison documented everything through her camera lens, though she seemed more focused on the natural scenery than Jacob's ongoing monologue. David managed to put his phone down long enough to finish his breakfast, though he checked it between every few bites. "Ready to see some real mountain views?" I asked as I packed up the cooking gear. The day hike to the overlook followed a well-maintained trail that wound through thick stands of aspen and pine, crossing 3 small streams on log bridges that previous hiking groups had constructed. The morning air carried the scent of pine resin and the earthy smell of decomposing leaves, and I pointed out edible plants along the way, identifying wild onions and lamb's quarters that grew near the water sources. Jacob immediately began straying from the group, veering off onto game trails to take photos with his expensive camera. Each time I called for him to stay with us, he waved dismissively and rejoined the group a few minutes later. "Jacob, we need to stay together," I said after the 3rd time he'd wandered off. "These side trails can be confusing. I can handle a nature walk, thanks. I'm not exactly new to hiking." Emily looked skeptical. "Where do you usually hike?" "I have a place in the Hamptons. Spend most weekends on the trails out there." I bit back my response to that. The Hamptons had some nice walking paths, but comparing them to Colorado backcountry was like comparing a swimming pool to the Pacific Ocean. Still, Jacob seemed convinced of his outdoor expertise, and arguing would only make him more determined to prove himself. We continued climbing through switchbacks that gained elevation gradually, the valley spreading out below us as we ascended. Madison filmed the changing views, while David periodically checked his phone for signal that wouldn't come until we reached higher ground. Ryan stayed close to me, breathing hard but keeping pace without complaint. 2 hours into the hike, we reached the scenic overlook that gave views across 3 separate mountain ranges. The vista stretched for miles, showing peak after peak receding into blue distance. A few scattered clouds cast moving shadows across the valleys below, and far to the south, I could make out the faint line of a distant highway. "This is incredible," Emily said, pulling out her phone to take pictures. "How high are we?" "About 9,500 feet. Those peaks across the valley hit 12,000. Madison set up for several different filming angles, while David finally got 2 bars of signal and immediately began checking messages. Jacob found a prominent rock outcropping and began what turned into a 20-minute photo session, asking Madison to film him against various dramatic backdrops. During lunch, Jacob launched into detailed stories about his hiking experiences, comparing every view and trail feature to something he'd encountered during his weekend adventures. He described technical climbing routes that didn't exist anywhere near the Hamptons and wildlife encounters that sounded suspiciously like scenes from adventure movies. "The key is staying confident out here," he told the group, gesturing broadly at the wilderness around us. "Nature respects strength. If you approach it with fear and superstition, you're already defeated." Madison dutifully filmed his speech while eating her trail mix, occasionally asking follow-up questions that encouraged him to elaborate. David managed to send a few text messages during the limited signal window, updating someone about his location and estimated return date. "How long have you been doing backcountry hiking?" Emily asked Jacob. "Started in college, actually. Did a lot of weekend trips through New England. Then when I got the place in the Hamptons, I really got serious about it. Probably average 15 to 20 miles of hiking per week during the summer months. I'd guided enough overconfident clients to recognize the pattern. Jacob had likely done some day hiking on established trails, maybe a few overnight camping trips at developed campgrounds, and now considered himself an experienced outdoorsman. His expensive gear compensated for his lack of real knowledge, and his weekend adventures had convinced him that wilderness was predictable and manageable. The return trip started in mid-afternoon, with the sun already angling lower through the trees. The downhill sections were easier on lungs but harder on knees, and I noticed Ryan struggling with the descent despite his careful pace. Emily helped him navigate some of the steeper sections, while Madison continued filming the group's interactions. Jacob resumed his habit of wandering off the main trail, exploring interesting rock formations and chasing photo opportunities. Each time he rejoined us, he seemed more confident in his ability to navigate independently. "This trail system is pretty straightforward," he announced during one of our rest stops. "Basic route finding stuff. Amazing how some people get lost out here." I checked my watch and calculated our remaining distance to camp, 2 more hours at our current pace, which would put us back just before sunset. Perfect timing if everyone stayed together and we maintained steady progress. "Jacob, I need you to stick with the group for the rest of the hike," I said. "Trail gets more complex as we get closer to camp." "No problem. Though honestly, I could probably find my way back from here on my own." Emily gave him a look that suggested she doubted that claim, but Jacob seemed oblivious to her skepticism. He shouldered his pack and fell in behind Madison, who was filming the afternoon light filtering through the aspen groves. We made good time for the next hour, staying together on the main trail while I pointed out landmarks and navigation features. The forest grew thicker as we descended, with larger trees blocking more of the sky and creating deeper shadows between the trunks. During our final rest stop, I counted heads automatically. Emily, David, Madison, Ryan, 4 people. "Where's Jacob?" The others looked around, suddenly realizing he wasn't visible on the trail ahead or behind us. Madison lowered her camera and scanned the forest. "He was right behind me 10 minutes ago," she said. "I thought he was still with us." I walked back up the trail, calling his name and listening for a response. The sound of my voice bounced off the trees and faded into silence. No answer. No movement in the undergrowth. No sign of where he might have gone. "Jacob!" I shouted louder, cupping my hands around my mouth to project the sound further. Only my echo came back, repeating his name through the canyon walls before disappearing into the vast silence of the mountains. Chapter 3. "Stay here," I told the others, dropping my pack next to the trail marker. "Don't move from this spot until I get back." Emily's face went pale. "Should we come with you?" "No. 4 people crashing through the woods will just make more noise and confusion. I can track better alone." I left them clustered around their gear and headed back up the trail, scanning the ground for any sign of where Jacob might have veered off. The afternoon sun slanted through the canopy at a steep angle now, creating patches of deep shadow between the larger trees. Perfect conditions for someone to get turned around if they wandered away from the marked path. 20 feet back, I found what I was looking for. Fresh boot prints in the soft earth beside a fallen log, leading off into the undergrowth toward a game trail that wound between 2 massive pine trees. Jacob's expensive hiking boots left clear impressions in the damp soil, and I could see where he'd pushed through a thicket of mountain laurel. I followed the prints deeper into the forest, calling his name every few minutes and listening for a response. The game trail twisted between boulders and deadfall, dropping down toward what sounded like running water. Jacob's tracks stayed clear in the softer ground, but the spacing between them looked wrong, too regular, like he'd been walking in a measured cadence instead of picking his way carefully through rough terrain. The sound of water grew louder as I descended, and ahead I could see a break in the trees where afternoon light filtered down into what looked like a small clearing. Jacob's prints led straight toward it, the boot marks becoming deeper and more pronounced in the increasingly muddy ground near the creek. I stepped through the last screen of branches and stopped dead. Jacob stood in the center of the clearing, perfectly motionless, his back to me. He faced a woman I'd never seen before, someone who definitely wasn't part of any hiking group that belonged in these mountains. She stood maybe 10 feet from him, close enough to touch, and everything about her presence made my skin crawl. Her dress had probably been white once, but now it hung in gray tatters that looked like they'd been rotting for decades. The fabric clung to her skeletal frame in places and hung loose in others, revealing glimpses of skin that had an unnatural, translucent quality. Her hair fell around her shoulders in long, stringy, black strands that moved despite the complete absence of any breeze in the clearing. But her face was the worst part. Sunken eyes that looked like dark holes punched through parchment, and cheekbones that jutted out sharp enough to cut. When she turned slightly, I caught sight of her profile and saw that her lips had pulled back from her teeth in what might have been a smile if those teeth hadn't been completely black with decay. "Jacob!" I shouted, loud enough to wake the dead. "Get away from her!" He didn't respond, didn't even twitch. Jacob stood there like a statue, staring at this nightmare of a woman with the same fixed attention he'd shown his phone screen during yesterday's hike. The woman's head turned toward me with a movement that was too smooth, too fluid, like her neck had more joints than it should. When she faced me fully, her mouth stretched wider than any human mouth had a right to stretch, revealing row after row of those blackened teeth. The sound that came out wasn't quite laughter and wasn't quite a hiss, but it made every muscle in my body want to run. In her hands, she held a bouquet of wildflowers, except these weren't fresh mountain blooms. The petals had gone brown and black with rot, hanging in soggy clumps from stems that looked ready to collapse. Insects crawled over the decaying flowers, tiny black beetles and pale grubs that dropped to the ground as she moved. The smell hit me even from across the clearing, sweet and cloying like fruit left too long in summer heat. She extended the bouquet toward Jacob, holding it out like an offering. Her movements were deliberate, ceremonial, and Jacob's right hand began to rise in response. His fingers stretched toward the rotting flowers as if pulled by invisible strings. I lunged forward, covering the distance between us in 3 long strides. My hand clamped around Jacob's wrist just as his fingertips brushed the outermost petals. The contact sent a shock up my arm, not electric but cold, like grabbing a piece of meat that had been stored too long in a freezer. "No," I shouted, yanking Jacob backward with enough force to spin him around. "Don't touch anything she offers." The woman's impossible grin vanished instantly. Her face collapsed back into its hollow, sunken configuration, and she took a step backward toward the tree line. For a moment, I thought she might rush us, might attack with those blackened claws I could see now at the ends of her fingers. Instead, she simply dissolved. 1 second, she stood there clutching her bouquet of decay. The next, she was spreading apart like smoke caught by wind. The tattered dress dispersed first, followed by her pale flesh, until only the vague outline of her figure remained visible against the darker shadows between the trees. Then even that was gone, leaving nothing but the normal forest sounds of wind and water. Jacob collapsed to his knees, gasping like he'd been held underwater. His whole body shook, and when he looked up at me, his eyes had trouble focusing. Blood trickled from his left nostril, a thin red line that he wiped away with the back of his hand. "What happened?" he asked, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. I was on the trail, and then... Can you stand?" I helped him to his feet, noting how his legs trembled with the effort. "We need to get back to the others." Jacob nodded, but didn't seem entirely present. His movements were slow and uncoordinated, like someone coming out of anesthesia. I kept one hand on his arm to steady him as we started back toward the game trail. That's when I noticed his left hand was clenched in a tight fist. "Jacob, open your hand." He looked down at his closed fingers with confusion, as if he'd forgotten he was holding something. When he uncurled them, a single flower lay across his palm. One of the rotting blooms from the woman's bouquet, its brown petals already starting to crumble at the edges. The smell that rose from it was concentrated decay, sweet and nauseating. "Drop it," I said immediately. But Jacob's fingers closed around the flower again, protective and possessive. "No," he whispered. "She gave it to me." Chapter 4. I kept my grip on Jacob's arm as we climbed back up from the clearing, his weight shifting against me with each unsteady step. His breathing came in short bursts, and every few minutes he'd stop completely, looking around the forest like he couldn't figure out where he was. "Jacob, we need to keep moving," I said, guiding him around a fallen log that blocked the game trail. "The others are waiting." He nodded, but his movements remained sluggish, disconnected. When we reached the main trail, I could see Emily pacing back and forth near our packs, her bear spray in one hand and her phone's flashlight in the other. David stood beside the trail marker, still checking for signal, while Madison and Ryan sat on their gear, watching the path we'd taken. "Thomas!" Emily called out when she spotted us emerging from the trees. "Is he okay?" The others rushed over as I helped Jacob to a nearby boulder where he could sit down. His face had gone pale, almost gray, and that trickle of blood from his nose had dried in a dark line down to his upper lip. "I'm fine," Jacob muttered, though he swayed even while sitting. Just got turned around for a minute. Emily knelt beside him, studying his face with the intensity of someone who'd taken first aid courses. "You don't look fine. What happened out there?" Jacob stared at her with blank confusion. I was on the trail, and then..." He pressed the palm of his free hand against his forehead. "Did I fall? Hit my head on something?" I watched him carefully while the others fussed over his condition. Jacob's left hand remained clenched in that tight fist, his knuckles white with the effort of keeping whatever was inside protected. The smell coming from between his fingers had gotten worse, that sickly, sweet odor of decomposition that made my stomach turn. "Let me see what you're holding," Emily said, reaching toward his closed hand. Jacob jerked his arm away so fast he nearly lost his balance on the rock. "No," he said, his voice sharp with possessiveness. "It's mine." Emily drew back, startled by his reaction. "Jacob, I just want to make sure you didn't pick up anything that might be harmful." I said no. Jacob clutched his fist against his chest, protective and defensive in a way that reminded me of a child guarding a treasured toy. Madison lowered her camera, which she'd been using to film Jacob's condition. "Maybe we should get him back to camp. He might have gotten dehydrated or something." I shouldered my pack and helped Jacob to his feet. The return hike took twice as long as it should have, with frequent stops while Jacob caught his breath or stared off into the forest with that unfocused expression. He kept asking the same questions over and over. What happened? How did I get separated? Why does my head feel so strange? None of us had good answers for him. By the time we reached our campsite, the sun had dropped low enough that the valley below us lay in shadow. Long fingers of darkness stretched between the trees, and the temperature had started its evening drop toward what would be a cold mountain night. I restarted the fire while the others helped Jacob to a spot on the fallen log where he could rest. Emily kept trying to get him to drink water, but he barely managed a few sips before pushing the bottle away. His attention kept drifting to the tree line, scanning the deepening shadows with an intensity that made me nervous. "Feeling any better?" Ryan asked quietly, settling down beside Jacob with his own water bottle. Jacob turned toward him slowly, like the question had taken several seconds to register. "Do you hear that?" "Hear what?" "The bells." Jacob tilted his head, listening to something the rest of us couldn't detect. "Really faint, but they're definitely there." I stopped feeding kindling to the fire and listened to the evening sounds around our camp. Wind moving through pine branches, the constant murmur of Willow Creek, a few birds settling in for the night. Nothing that sounded remotely like bells. "I don't hear anything unusual," Emily said, glancing around the camp with renewed nervousness. Jacob's face scrunched with concentration, like he was trying to tune into a distant radio station. It's getting clearer now, like church bells, maybe? But not quite right. David finally looked up from his satellite phone. There aren't any churches within 40 miles of here, man. I know what I'm hearing, Jacob insisted, his voice taking on an edge I hadn't heard from him before. Not the boastful confidence from yesterday, but something brittle and defensive. I finished getting the fire established and started preparing dinner, keeping one eye on Jacob while I worked. His behavior matched patterns I'd seen twice before over the years. Clients who'd wandered off and encountered things they shouldn't have, then returned to camp changed in ways that started subtle and got worse as the night wore on. The first time it happened, I'd convinced myself the guy just had altitude sickness or heat exhaustion. Sent him home the next morning after he spent the entire night claiming he could hear voices calling his name from the forest. Found his body 3 weeks later when another hiking group reported seeing someone in expensive gear wandering alone near the high peaks, talking to empty air. The second time, I recognized the signs early enough to get most of the group out safely. But the affected client had slipped away from camp during the pre-dawn hours, leaving behind only his boots and a pile of decaying flowers arranged in a perfect circle. Now Jacob sat on the log staring into the woods, that rotting flower clutched against his chest, like a talisman. The smell radiating from his closed fist had gotten strong enough that Madison moved upwind from him without comment. "Dinner's ready," I announced, spooning portions of rehydrated beef stew into metal bowls. Everyone except Jacob ate with normal appetite, the day's hiking having worked up their hunger. Jacob accepted his bowl but barely touched the food, stirring it around with his spoon while continuing to scan the darkening forest. "You need to eat something," Emily told him. "You lost a lot of energy today." Jacob looked at her like he was trying to remember who she was. "The bells are getting louder," he said instead of responding to her concern. "Don't you think we should find out where they're coming from?" "No," I said immediately. "We stay by the fire until morning. That's rule 1. But if someone's out there ringing bells, they might need help." The irony of Jacob suddenly caring about helping strangers wasn't lost on me, considering his dismissive attitude toward every safety warning I'd given them. But this wasn't concern for others driving his interest. This was something else taking root in his mind, using his own voice to make suggestions that served a different purpose. "Rule 2, I reminded him. "If you hear bells at night, you stay by the fire without investigating." Jacob's jaw tightened with frustration. "Those are just made-up rules designed to scare tourists." "Then why are you hearing bells?" That question stopped him cold. Jacob stared at me across the fire, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to form words that wouldn't come. In his lap, his left hand tightened around whatever he was holding, and I caught another whiff of that sweet decay smell. Madison had been filming our conversation, but now she lowered her camera and dug through her pack. "I've got some sleeping pills in my first aid kit," she offered. "Might help you get some rest." "Medication won't help what's affecting him," I said. Emily looked at me sharply. "What do you mean? What's affecting him?" I poked at the fire with a long stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkening sky. Same thing that affects everyone who takes flowers from strangers in the woods. Jacob's head snapped up, his eyes suddenly focusing with laser intensity. "What flowers?" "I didn't take any flowers." But his left hand remained clenched in that protective fist, and the smell of rotting vegetation continued to waft from between his fingers. The contradiction between his words and his actions was so obvious that even David looked up from his phone to stare. "Jacob," Emily said gently, "you're holding something in your hand. We can smell it from here." Jacob looked down at his closed fist with genuine confusion, like he'd forgotten it existed. For a moment, I thought he might open his fingers and release whatever was inside. Instead, he pulled his hand closer to his body, more protective than before. "She gave it to me," he whispered, the same words he'd used in the clearing. "It's mine." Ryan shifted uncomfortably on his seat. Who gave what to you? But Jacob had already stopped listening to our conversation. His attention had turned back to the forest, head tilted at that listening angle again. As full darkness settled over our camp, his breathing became more shallow and rapid. The bells are beautiful, he said to no one in particular, like music. I added more wood to the fire, building it higher than usual. The flames threw dancing light across Jacob's face, highlighting the glassy, distant look that had taken over his eyes. He'd stopped responding to direct questions, stopped eating, stopped participating in anything except his mysterious listening. Around 10 o'clock, Jacob stood up abruptly and began pacing around the edge of our fire's light. Back and forth, always staying just inside the circle of illumination, but never moving closer to the center where the rest of us sat. His left hand remained pressed against his chest, clutching whatever was inside it. "She's calling to me," he announced during one of his circuits. I can hear her voice mixed in with the bells. "Who's calling?" Madison asked, though I noticed she'd stopped filming and had her bear spray within easy reach. "The woman in white." Jacob paused in his pacing to stare directly into the darkest section of forest. "She's waiting just beyond the trees. She says she has more flowers to show me." A chill ran through the group that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Emily moved closer to the fire, while David actually put his phone down and paid attention to what was happening around him. "Jacob, there's no one out there," Ryan said quietly. "It's just your imagination. You're wrong." Jacob's voice carried absolute certainty. "She's beautiful, more beautiful than anything I've ever seen." I knew from experience that arguing with him would be pointless now. Whatever had taken hold of Jacob's mind was stronger than logic or reason. The entity in the clearing had established its connection, and now it was reeling him in gradually, letting him think each step toward the darkness was his own choice. The flower in Jacob's fist had turned completely black, crumbling at the edges but somehow still holding together. Tiny pieces of it dropped to the ground as he paced, leaving a trail of decomposed petals around the fire's perimeter. "The bells are so clear now," Jacob murmured, stopping at the very edge of the firelight. "And her voice, she's telling me not to be afraid." He stood there swaying slightly, one foot in the light and one foot in the shadow, staring into the black woods where none of us could see anything at all. Chapter 5. The flower fell from Jacob's fingers like a stone dropping into water. One moment he stood swaying at the fire's edge, clutching that rotting bloom against his chest, and the next, his hand opened and the blackened petals scattered across the ground. Jacob looked down at his empty palm with the same confused expression he'd worn all evening, as if he couldn't understand how something so precious had slipped away. Then he stepped backward into the darkness, not stumbled or tripped, but took a deliberate step away from the fire's protective circle. His expensive hiking boots crunched on dry pine needles as he moved deeper into the shadows between the trees. "Jacob, stop!" I shouted, jumping to my feet. "Get back here now!" He didn't respond, didn't even pause. Jacob walked into the forest with the measured pace of someone following a well-marked trail, though nothing but blackness stretched ahead of him. I lunged for my pack and yanked out the heavy-duty flashlight, thumbing the switch as I headed toward the spot where Jacob had disappeared. The LED beam cut through the darkness, illuminating tree trunks and underbrush, but no sign of the man who'd vanished between them. Emily's hand clamped around my arm before I could take another step. Her fingers dug into my jacket sleeve with enough force to stop me dead. "Thomas, no," she said, her voice tight with fear. "Your own rules. Rule 1. Nobody leaves camp after dark." I stared into the woods where my flashlight beam revealed nothing but empty forest. Every instinct screamed at me to follow Jacob, to bring him back before whatever had called to him finished its work. But Emily was right. The rules existed for a reason, learned through 30 years of watching people disappear into these mountains. "Jacob," I called again, projecting my voice as far into the darkness as possible. "Come back to the fire." Silence answered me. not even the sound of footsteps moving through the underbrush. I lowered the flashlight and stepped back into the fire's circle of light. The others had pulled their gear closer together, creating a tight cluster around the flames. Madison sat with her knees drawn up to her chest, while David gripped his satellite phone like a lifeline. Ryan hadn't moved from his spot on the log, but his eyes tracked every shadow beyond our small, safe zone. "Maybe he'll come back on his own," Emily said quietly, "when he realizes how dark it is out there." I fed another piece of wood into the fire, sending sparks shooting upward. "He's not coming back. How can you be so sure?" David asked. Before I could answer, Jacob's voice drifted back from somewhere deep in the woods, faint and distant, but unmistakably his. "I'm here," he called out. "I came like you asked." The sound seemed to come from the direction of the creek, maybe 200 yards from our camp. Jacob's words carried clearly through the still mountain air, though I couldn't make out any response to what he'd said. "Who's he talking to?" Madison whispered. "Listen," I told them. Jacob's voice came again, closer this time, but moving parallel to our camp rather than toward it. "I know you're beautiful. I saw you in the clearing." A pause, as if he was listening to someone respond. Then, "Yes, I dropped the flower, but you said you had more to show me." Emily grabbed my arm again. "Thomas, there's no one else talking. It's just him." I knew that. Strained my ears, trying to catch even a whisper of a second voice. But only Jacob's words reached us through the darkness. Either his companion spoke too quietly for sound to carry, or she didn't need words to communicate what she wanted him to hear. Jacob's voice moved again, following what sounded like a path that curved around our camp in a wide arc. "They tried to stop me, but I knew you were waiting." More silence then. "Where are we going?" "These flowers. They're different from the one you gave me before." The conversation continued like that for the next hour. Jacob talking to someone we couldn't hear, his voice moving through the forest in patterns that made no geographical sense. Sometimes he sounded like he was climbing uphill toward the ridge. Other times his words seemed to come from down near the water. Once I could have sworn he was speaking from directly behind our camp, though my flashlight revealed nothing when I swept the beam across that section of woods. "Of course I trust you," Jacob said during one of these invisible exchanges. "You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." David held up his satellite phone, showing 2 bars of signal. "I'm calling for help." "No." I reached over and pushed the device down. "No rescue team will come into these woods at night. And even if they did, they'd just end up lost too. We can't just sit here and listen to him talk to empty air." "That's exactly what we're going to do." David looked like he wanted to argue, but another burst of Jacob's voice from the darkness cut him off. "I don't understand. Why can't I touch them?" A longer pause this time, maybe 30 seconds of forest silence before Jacob spoke again. "But you said... you promised me more flowers." His voice had taken on a different quality now. Less wonder and more confusion, like someone trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. The confident tone from his earlier words had cracked, replaced by something that might have been the first hint of concern. "Wait," Jacob called out. "Where are you going? Don't leave me here." The sound of branches snapping reached our camp as Jacob moved through the underbrush with less care than before. His footsteps crashed through what sounded like thick vegetation, moving faster now. "Please," he shouted. "I did what you asked. I came to find you." More crashing, growing more frantic. Jacob was running through the woods, chasing something that stayed just out of his reach. His voice grew more distant as he moved deeper into the wilderness, but the desperation in it came through clearly. "I can see you," he called. "You're right there. Why won't you stop?" The fire burned lower, and I added more wood to keep the flames high. Around me, the others sat frozen in place, listening to Jacob's increasingly panicked shouts echo off the canyon walls. None of us spoke. None of us moved except to occasionally glance at each other with the kind of look people share when they're witnessing something that will change them permanently. Jacob's voice grew fainter as whatever he was chasing led him further from camp. Sometimes minutes passed between his shouts, long enough that we started to hope the nightmare was over. Then his words would carry back to us on the mountain wind, more desperate than before. "Please don't leave me alone out here," he begged somewhere around midnight. "I gave up everything to follow you." By 1 a.m, we could barely hear him anymore. His voice had become a distant echo bouncing between the peaks, too far away to make out individual words. But the tone remained clear, pleading, frightened, lost. David checked his phone constantly, though whether he was looking for the time or hoping for some kind of message, I couldn't tell. Emily sat with her bear spray across her knees, scanning the tree line like she expected something to come charging out of the darkness. Madison had given up any pretense of documenting our trip. Her camera stayed buried in her pack while she watched the fire with the fixed attention of someone afraid to look anywhere else. At 2 a.m, Jacob's voice changed completely. "No!" he screamed, the sound sharp enough to cut through the mountain stillness. "No! Get away from me!" Terror. Pure, absolute terror in a voice I'd heard joking and boasting just hours before. The kind of fear that strips away everything civilized and human, leaving only the animal knowledge that death is coming. "Help me!" Jacob shrieked from somewhere deep in the canyon. "Somebody help me!" His cries bounced off the rock walls, returning to us as fractured echoes that seemed to come from every direction at once. The mountain itself became a voice, repeating Jacob's pleas in distorted fragments that faded and returned and faded again. "I can't. Oh God, I can't get away," he screamed. "They're everywhere." Ryan stood up abruptly, his face white in the firelight. "We have to do something." "Sit down," I told him. "He's going to die out there. He's already dead." The words came out harsher than I'd intended, but they were true. Whatever Jacob was running from in those woods, whatever had been calling to him all evening, it had finally shown him its real face. And judging by the terror in his voice, that face was nothing like the beautiful woman he'd described. Jacob's screams grew more frantic, echoing off the canyon walls with increasing desperation. "Please," he sobbed. "I just want to go home. I just want to go home." "Something's chasing him," Emily whispered. Or something was finally done playing with him, done pretending to be beautiful, done offering gifts, done leading him deeper into the wilderness with promises of more flowers to see. Now came the part Jacob should have expected when he accepted that first rotting bloom. "They're touching me," he wailed. "Their hands are so cold." His voice grew more distant with each scream, moving deeper into the canyon system where the walls would muffle sound and the darkness went absolute. We listened to Jacob beg and plead and cry for help that would never come, his words becoming smaller and more desperate until they barely registered above the wind. Then, somewhere around 2:30, the screaming stopped. Complete silence fell over the mountains. No wind, no water sounds, no night birds calling. Even the fire seemed to burn more quietly, as if the entire wilderness was holding its breath. We sat frozen around the dying flames, waiting for Jacob's voice to return, waiting for more screams, more pleas for help, anything to prove he was still alive out there in the darkness. But minutes passed without a sound from the canyon, then more minutes, until the silence became something solid and permanent. I got up to feed more wood into the fire, my movements loud in the stillness. The flames climbed higher, pushing our circle of light a few feet further into the surrounding blackness. But beyond that protective glow, the forest remained empty and quiet. David finally broke the silence. "Is he—" "Yeah," I said, settling back onto my log. "He is." None of them asked how I could be sure. They'd heard the same terror I had, the same desperate screams that cut off into nothing. Whatever had taken Jacob into those woods was finished with him now. We spent the rest of the night feeding the fire and waiting for dawn. Nobody talked about what we'd heard. Nobody speculated about what might have happened to Jacob in his final moments. We just sat there in our shrinking circle of light, listening to the mountain silence, while I added log after log to keep the flames burning until the sun finally rose. Chapter 6. I waited until the first gray light crept between the trees before leaving the fire to search for Jacob's remains. The others sat around the dying flames like statues, none of them having slept after the screaming stopped. Emily clutched her bear spray with white knuckles, dark shadows carved under her eyes from hours of staring into the darkness. David kept checking his satellite phone every few minutes, thumb scrolling through empty message screens as if Jacob might suddenly text an explanation for everything. Madison hadn't moved from her spot near the gear pile, her camera buried somewhere in her pack where she wouldn't have to see it. Ryan spoke only in whispers, when he spoke at all, his voice barely audible above the creek's constant murmur. "Stay by the fire," I told them, shouldering my pack. "I'll be back in an hour." Nobody argued. Nobody asked what I expected to find. I followed the edge of our camp toward the sound of running water, scanning the ground for any sign of where Jacob had first entered the forest. His expensive hiking boots had left clear prints in the soft earth near our tents, but the trail disappeared once he'd moved onto the harder ground between the trees. The stream ran about 200 yards from our campsite, cutting a shallow channel through gray rocks worn smooth by decades of mountain runoff. I worked my way along the bank, checking both sides for anything Jacob might have left behind. Pieces of torn clothing, scattered gear, blood on the stones. Evidence that would help explain what had taken him in the night. 20 minutes downstream from our camp, I found his boots. They sat side by side on a flat boulder next to the water, arranged with the kind of careful precision someone uses when placing shoes beside a hotel bed. The expensive leather showed no signs of damage, no scuff marks or tears that would suggest a struggle. Jacob had simply stepped out of them and walked away barefoot into the wilderness. I climbed down to the boulder and examined the boots more closely. The laces were still tied exactly as Jacob had worn them. The tongues pulled straight and the cuffs folded down in neat lines. No dirt or debris inside the boots suggested he'd taken them off voluntarily, rather than having them torn from his feet. The boulder where they rested showed no other signs of disturbance. No footprints in the sand around its base, no broken branches or displaced rocks that would indicate someone had struggled there. Just the boots, sitting perfectly aligned like an offering left for whoever might come looking. I spent another 30 minutes searching the area around the stream, following both banks until the water curved out of sight between the canyon walls. Nothing. No torn clothing, no scattered gear, no trace that Jacob Williams had ever existed beyond those empty boots on the stone. When I returned to camp, the others looked up with desperate hope that faded as soon as they saw my expression. I dropped the boots beside the fire without explanation, watching their faces change as they recognized what the neat arrangement meant. "Pack your gear," I told them. "We're leaving." They moved like people underwater, slow and deliberate and careful not to make sudden movements that might shatter whatever fragile calm they'd built around themselves. Emily rolled her sleeping bag with mechanical precision, checking each fold twice before securing the straps. David disconnected his various charging cables and devices, coiling them into perfect loops before tucking them into padded compartments. Madison stuffed items into her pack without organizing them, just cramming everything down until the zippers barely closed. Ryan sat on his log, staring at Jacob's empty boots until I walked over and picked them up myself. The leather felt normal under my hands, not cold or strange or marked by whatever had claimed their owner, just expensive hiking gear that would never be worn again. "Should we bring those?" Emily asked quietly. "Evidence," I said, tying the laces together and hanging them from my pack's external straps. The hike back to the trailhead took 3 hours of steady walking, our pace faster than the leisurely exploration we'd used on the way up. I led them quickly through the forest, choosing the most direct route back to civilization and the safety of marked trails where normal rules applied. We passed the clearing where I'd found Jacob with the pale woman around noon, when the sun hit the small meadow at its brightest angle. I slowed our pace as we approached, curious to see what the daylight revealed about that place. The ground was completely barren. Where wildflowers had grown in scattered patches 2 days earlier, nothing remained but dark earth scraped clean of vegetation. Not even weeds or grass, just bare soil that looked like it had been burned and salted. The trees around the clearing's edge showed normal green foliage, but inside that perfect circle, not a single living thing remained. Emily noticed the dead ground and moved closer to my side as we passed. "What happened here?" "Nothing grows where she walks," I said, keeping my voice low enough that the others wouldn't hear. "Never has." We moved past the clearing without stopping, rejoining the main trail that led down toward the parking area. The group fell into single file behind me, each person lost in their own thoughts about what they'd witnessed. The silence felt like a protective barrier none of them wanted to break. David's satellite phone finally found consistent signal as we descended below 8,000 feet, and the device immediately began buzzing with incoming messages and missed call notifications. He checked the screen but didn't answer any of the calls, just stared at the accumulating voicemails like they came from another world. "My office has been trying to reach me for hours," he said during one of our rest stops. "They probably think I'm dead." The irony of that statement hung in the air between us. David was very much alive, sitting on a fallen log drinking water from his expensive bottle. Jacob was the one who'd never answer his phone again, never return to his Manhattan office or his Hamptons weekend property. "What do we tell people?" Emily asked as we resumed hiking. "When they ask about Jacob?" I'd been expecting that question since we'd started the descent. 5 people had hiked into the mountains, but only 4 would be returning. Explanations would be required, official reports filed, questions asked by people who'd never believed the truth. "We tell them Jacob wandered off despite warnings and never came back," I said, which is true. "But what about the—" Madison gestured vaguely toward the forest around us. "The woman, the flowers, all of it." "What woman?" I asked. "What flowers?" Madison started to respond, then understood what I was telling her. The truth wouldn't help anyone, wouldn't bring Jacob back, wouldn't change what had happened in those woods. It would only mark the 4 of them as unreliable witnesses to their own experience. "He just disappeared," Ryan said quietly, testing the words. "We called for him, but he never answered." "That's right," I confirmed. "Jacob Williams wandered away from camp against direct safety instructions and failed to return. Search teams will look for him, but these mountains are dangerous. People get lost all the time." We reached the trailhead parking lot just after 3 in the afternoon. Their vehicles sat exactly where they'd left them 3 days earlier. Expensive SUVs with GPS systems and heated seats and all the modern conveniences that meant nothing in the wilderness. Jacob's BMW remained locked and empty, keys probably still in his tent pocket or wherever his body had ended up. The others loaded their gear with the same mechanical efficiency they'd used breaking camp. Nobody talked about future plans or staying in touch or processing what they'd experienced together. They just wanted distance from the mountains and everything that lived in them. Emily approached me as I threw my pack into the bed of my truck. Dark circles still shadowed her eyes, and her hands shook slightly as she zipped up her jacket. "Thomas," she said, glancing back toward the mountain peaks visible above the tree line. "Is there any chance Jacob might still be alive out there? Maybe hurt or lost, but still." I followed her gaze to the high country where snow capped the distant summits. Those peaks had stood for millions of years, watching civilizations rise and fall, while older things moved through the valleys and clearings between them. Jacob was part of that ancient cycle now, claimed by entities that had been collecting the foolish and the arrogant long before humans built cities or invented rules. Jacob made his choice when he broke the rules, I told her. Now he belongs to whatever was calling him. Emily nodded slowly like she'd expected that answer but needed to hear it confirmed. She walked back to her SUV without another word, climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. I watched their convoy of expensive vehicles pull out of the parking lot and disappear down the mountain road toward Denver. 4 people returning to their normal lives, carrying memories they'd probably spend years trying to rationalize or forget. They'd tell their version of the story to park rangers and police investigators, describing Jacob as a reckless client who'd ignored safety protocols and vanished into the wilderness. Official search teams would spend a few days combing the area around our campsite, maybe find his boots by the stream if they looked hard enough, but they'd never find Jacob himself, and eventually the case would be filed under missing person presumed dead, and forgotten by everyone except the people who'd heard his final screams echoing through the canyon. I sat in my truck for a long moment, watching the mountains where I'd spent 30 years guiding city people through experiences they'd never understand. Most of them followed the rules and returned home safely with stories about wildlife and scenic vistas, but some ignored the warnings, convinced their money and education made them immune to dangers older than civilization. Those were the ones who never made it back to their expensive cars. I started the engine and headed down the winding road toward town, leaving Jacob's BMW alone in the empty parking lot. By morning, someone would notice the abandoned vehicle and contact the authorities. The search would begin officially, teams of volunteers and professionals spending their time and resources looking for a man who'd already been found. The mountains kept their secrets, and Jacob Williams had become one of them.